If you like this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, your name can appear at the beginning of this and many other upcoming videos. Nostalgia. It's a word that's carried a fascinating yet rather odd meaning over the years. When someone brings up nostalgia, we associate it with memories of days gone, our most treasured childhood memories. Sometimes we use nostalgia to help us get by in life as it becomes more complicated as we enter adulthood. But there's a lot of different ways in which one can interpret nostalgia. Let me ask you a question. When you hear the word nostalgia, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you think about the days you went to school, making friends in class and playing games on the playground? Do you remember going to the park to lie in the grass and look at the clouds? Do you remember that family vacation your parents took you on, going out of state to have fun at a hotel or a water park? Do you remember spending time with your favorite pet, your first crush, or your favorite foods that ended up getting discontinued? Well, whatever your answer is, I think there's one definitive thing that we all like to associate nostalgia with: the media we consumed growing up. Movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comics, books, even music. As children, we mostly viewed media as a means to escape into a fantasy world, taking our minds off the boredoms of reality in order to have fun. And as cliche as this is going to sound, growing up as a kid in the 90s, media ruled my whole world. I still remember those old days begging my parents for quarters to play all sorts of arcade games, or getting home from school and ignoring my homework assignment in favor of playing a game or watching something on TV. There's so many timeless classics I associate the 90s with. From the cartoons featured on Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, PBS Kids, and Toon Disney, to my huge library of video games I would play all day. And I don't think I'm alone on this. There's a lot of 90s kids like myself who like to look back on all the classics we grew up with and hold them to a high standard for the generations of movies, TV shows, and video games that would follow. And I think it's because, for whatever reason, there was just some sort of uniqueness that came with the 90s. It's a decade that's practically defined by nostalgia. These days we seem to have more and more people talking about the media they grew up with in the 90s, reflecting on the impact they made on pop culture and how they aged very well. Even holding a substantial amount of relevance decades later, we talk about the smart writing we weren't able to appreciate as children, because our adolescent minds prevented us from thinking critically. We gain a greater appreciation for those movies and TV shows as the stories surrounding them still hold up. The 90s was this remarkable moment in time that could never be recaptured, with so many feelings and emotions that feel exclusive to this time period. A time when Disney was at its peak with some of the greatest animated movies anyone had ever seen, when hand-drawn 2D animation was at an all-time high, when people were discovering the potential of video games, whether it was Nintendo, Sega Genesis, or PlayStation, when kids were discovering the wide world of anime with shows like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Digimon, and Dragon Ball Z. There's a lot of things that came out in the 90s that helped define so many people's childhoods, and naturally people are gonna treasure those memories. But what about things from our nostalgia that were the opposite of good? Things from our childhood that were bad. Movies, TV shows, games, and cartoons that were boring or downright terrible. These are the kind of things that parents would look at in confusion and ask their kids, what do you see in this? On one hand, it's pretty easy to distinct things that really didn't age well. But on the other, this is the part where nostalgia becomes both fascinating and yet very odd. Because from this point we can end up doing one of two things. Do we recognize how boring or terrible it is and grow out of it? Or do we develop a soft spot for it in spite of how bad it is? Because as much as we try to deny it, nostalgia has a very strong grip on us. It can cause us to say things against our better judgment, even speak highly of things that are embarrassing in retrospect. Say you remember this movie you grew up with as a kid and it's an embarrassing movie upon looking back on it as an adult. But in spite of how bad it is, you remember all those silly feelings you felt watching it as a kid, and you can't help but smile thinking about those memories. Thus, we develop a nostalgic connection with it. We continue to look back on this thing with a fascination, in spite of it being not really remarkable or something that doesn't hold up after we developed our brains. And I think there's no other movie that embodies this feeling more than Space Jam. It all began in 1992, when Nike struck a deal with Michael Jordan to advertise the Air Jordan shoe brand. But they needed something else to grab people's attention, so they figured, why not get the Looney Tunes involved? The commercials were such a big hit that Warner Brothers got the idea to turn this into a movie. And if you were a kid at the time, and if you were a fan of both the Looney Tunes and Michael Jordan, like I was, this sounded like the most awesome thing ever. Michael Jordan and the Looney Tunes joining forces to fight aliens. How can you not get sucked into that? Of course, that's from when I was a kid. I remember liking Space Jam a lot when I first saw it and even watched it multiple times on VHS. But as I got older and got into other interests, I don't remember giving it that much thought. It wouldn't be until years later when I'd see this movie again and I remember liking it noticeably less than when I was a lot younger. And of course, with the upcoming release of the sequel, the movie was placed on HBO Max, so I gave it one more watch to see how it holds up today. And I'm starting to wonder what the hell I ever saw in this movie. It's not the worst, but it's far from good. I suppose it's best to start this review off by talking about how the movie opens. And to be fair, it's actually a pretty good opening. We see a young MJ speaking with his father about his goals in life, playing basketball, making it to the top, and then moving on to play baseball. Afterwards, we get a montage of Michael Jordan's career as a basketball player, as well as a collection of old family photos. The opening is practically a documentary on MJ's life, growing up in high school, recapping his achievements in basketball, capturing the massive weight of just how big he was back in the day. It's practically playing a tribute to the man himself, and you can tell that a lot of passion was put into it. When you watch this intro, you really get the sensation that you're watching a Michael Jordan movie. It fully captures just how much of an icon he was, and the impact he made on sports culture. But after this, things start to get a little bumpy. And this is because the pacing of the film is all over the place. There's a lot of times throughout the movie where they switch between slowing down and suddenly going at a quick rush. I think this was probably the intention. The slower scenes in the human world are meant to explore the daily life of Michael Jordan, presenting him as down-to-earth and grounded, while the Looney Tunes scenes are meant to be more energetic and hyper to fit the tone of the original cartoons. The problem though is that the story just feels really jumbled and not very focused. There's a number of subplots present in the movie and they don't really get enough establishment. Some of them feel completely forgotten about and just come across as pointless filler. For example, one of the subplots focuses on the NBA players whose talent was stolen from the aliens. We see them trying to cope with their lost fame, how they start to feel outcasted in society with their life spiraling out of control. This could have been a really interesting plot point. We could have explored the more personal lives of these people as they try to deal with their dilemma, but the movie doesn't really pay any mind to this plot point. We aren't given ample time to connect with them as characters or relate to what they're going through, and it doesn't even affect the plot, which is a shame because it was a really interesting concept. The pacing also has an effect on other plot points, like the one with Wayne Knight's character. He's supposed to be MJ's partner and help him out, but his only real contribution is just bumbling around like a buffoon. The basketball game in particular feels really rushed. This is supposed to be the highlight of the movie and it doesn't feel like they did enough with it. The first half of the match is only 2.5 minutes long, yet the second half is 5 minutes long, with a couple of missed opportunities to let other Toon characters have a spotlight. I feel like the first half of the game could have been longer if the plot was more focused and had less of that filler. But overall, the biggest problem with this story is that it's particularly weak. They don't really do anything interesting with this setup, and that's mainly because the nature of the film is simply to act as a giant advertisement.
Get your Hanes on, lace up your Nikes, grab your Wheaties and your Gatorade, and we'll pick up a Big Mac on the way to the ballpark.
I know people will say that calling the film a giant advertisement is obvious, but they make it really hard to talk about anything else because of how much they're trying to shove it in your face. It's Warner Brothers capitalizing on the popularity of Michael Jordan with sports fans and the Looney Tunes with children, while throwing in a bunch of unfitting product placement. And by making this the priority, every other element of the film suffers for it. They weren't focused on giving the film any sort of timeless rewatch value and just wanted to make money off a hot trend. And it's made pretty obvious in the way the film handles its characters. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start by talking about one of the more, shall we say, popular characters from the movie.
Yes. Don't ever call me doll.
In order to help draw attention to the film, the producers wanted to use it as an opportunity to introduce a new Looney Tunes character. Now that sounds pretty cool. A new Looney Tunes character making their debut appearance in a crossover with Michael Jordan? That sounds like a big deal. Unfortunately, the movie does absolutely nothing with her. Lola is nothing more than eye candy for the furry fans and a lame excuse to give Bugs Bunny a girlfriend. Her personality is extremely generic and she has no influence on the plot whatsoever. She doesn't even feel like a Looney Tunes character. She's just a generic sports girl. She could have just as easily been a live-action human character. Maybe I could see a purpose to this if they gave her more of a personality, something that would let her blend in with the other Toon characters. But she just sticks out like a sore thumb. Her cameo as a news anchor from Tweety's High-Flying Adventure had more personality. She's completely forced into the movie and it's a real shame that this was supposed to be her debut. Are the other Toon characters handled better? Well, no. They're boring and bland and really don't amount to much. It's mostly just having them there for the sake of being there. As a matter of fact, Chuck Jones, who was still alive at the time of the film's release, really hated it. He despised the way the Toons were depicted in the movie with them saying and doing things they would never do. And to be honest, I can see where he was coming from. There's a number of times where the Toons feel out of their element or out of character, which results in the film's comedic writing feeling shallow. Even the interactions they have with MJ are stale and boring. Think about that. The selling point of this movie is seeing Michael Jordan interacting with the Looney Tunes, and the chemistry is really flat. He just kinda stands around watching them doing their own thing. And even when he has a conversation with them, it just feels devoid of anything surreal. It's Michael Jordan and the Looney Tunes. I'm expecting a little more surrealism. I remember MJ having more chemistry with Bugs Bunny in the Nike's commercial this movie was obviously based on. The Looney Tunes are supposed to be timeless characters. To this day, millions of people around the world are quoting them and discussing the impact they had on cartoon comedy. This movie doesn't do anything to replicate what made them so iconic. They mostly act as background characters taking a backseat to the athletes and big-name actors they're clearly trying to capitalize on. The only character that's kind of interesting is Michael Jordan himself. The movie does take its time to give us an idea of MJ's life after retirement, bringing his family into the movie and having him try out new interests. It allows his character to feel more grounded and relatable. Unfortunately, he doesn't do a good job acting it out. To put it simply, MJ is a much better basketball player than he is an actor. Throughout the movie, he doesn't emote as much as he should be, and he struggles to have a convincing conversation with the Tunes. His direction is really wooden and lifeless, and his body language is really flimsy and bland. They don't even utilize the other human characters to their advantage. Everyone in this movie just acts like they're in a commercial. Even for a movie that was meant to be seen as a commercial, this is some really terrible stuff. There's no wit to how the Looney Tunes are portrayed, the human cast is dull, the acting is stilted, and for a movie about Michael Jordan interacting with the Looney Tunes, they don't make it fun to watch Michael Jordan interacting with the Looney Tunes. The way the story is laid out and paced feels like you're watching the first draft. They didn't bother to tweak the script or anything like that, they just made a movie out of the very first theme that came to their heads. The plot is completely unfocused with the way it transitions between different subplots and even has a number of plot holes as a result of its illogical script. Why didn't the aliens hire actors for their theme park? Why didn't they just abduct the NBA players? What are the rules of the basketball game if they can just freely beat up the other team? And why did the Looney Tunes even challenge the aliens to basketball? Couldn't they just use their Looney Tune powers to kick their asses? In fact, that's what they end up doing. If you can get Wile E. Coyote to blow them up, or Pepe Le Pew to knock them out with his stink, or Tweety to throw down on them with martial arts, or Sam and Fudd to shoot them with their guns, or Daffy to paint red paint on them to get a bull to chase after them, why didn't you just do that from the start? This movie is just a mess. From the story, to the portrayal of the Looney Tunes, to the acting, to the pacing, to the shameless product placement, Space Jam is just an embarrassment on every level. It's simply objectively bad. Which leaves me to ask, if this movie was so bad, how did it become a cult classic? What about it was so good that it's getting a sequel 20 years later? Well, this ultimately brings us back to the thing that started this video, nostalgia. Whenever someone speaks positively of this movie, they only ever talk about how much they loved it as a kid. And when you get down to it, this movie is as 90s time capsule as it gets. And the movie practically embraces that fact. It allows the people who grew up with this decade to peacefully revisit something they saw growing up. And there were a lot of people who grew up with this movie. They want to revisit a simpler time and try to get in touch with their inner childhood. And I can't understand where these people are coming from. There's a lot of things from my childhood that I reflect on as an adult and recognize them as bad, but they represent a naive and innocent state of mind that I look back on fondly. It's cheesy, but it's a harmless kind of cheese that lets us relive a piece of our past in a lighthearted way. Does that make the positive reception to this movie extremely biased? Well, yeah, obviously it does. But I think the people who look back fondly on this movie are aware of that. I probably shouldn't be all that surprised. Thinking about the absurd premise years later, I always had a feeling that Space Jam was one of those things from my nostalgia that I would inevitably grow out of. It's basically the opposite of Ice Age, where instead of getting better as I got older, this movie just got worse. Though I suppose the charm of the movie comes from just how much of a product of the time it was. This is the same decade that gave us the Donkey Kong TV show. Tell me you're surprised that this movie exists. I suppose there is a uniqueness to just how much of a cash grab it is. It's one of those movies you can enjoy ironically only for how ridiculous and shameless it is. This is the movie the word nostalgia was made for. And I suppose that's what really gave Space Jam its lasting power and its status as a cult classic. So if you're feeling nostalgic for it, or if you really just want to see Michael Jordan with the Looney Tunes, you could probably give it a watch. There's definitely a lot of things I would rather recommend to people, but you know, it could be worse. In spite of its dozens of flaws, I can see some of the appeal and why it might have stuck with people for so long. It brought the Looney Tunes into the real world. It played a great tribute to Michael Jordan's career as a basketball player. It has an amazing soundtrack with so many songs that were made famous specifically because of this movie. And it has a couple of standout scenes that are actually really cool in spite of how dated the rest of the film is. Will I ever see it again? Probably not, but I suppose there was no harm in watching it one more time. It's relatively harmless and a rather useful time capsule for looking back on film during the 90s. In the end, it's a really corny movie, but there is a bit of fun to be had in its corniness. Will the sequel be just as corny? Well, we'll find out soon enough. Until then, thanks for watching and stay cool.